choice. I was telling the graduate students earlier, larger than I thought when I got in this, so I'm really trying to figure, okay, so what am I going to add here? So there is a large literature on this. I'm actually thinking what's missing is there's much more empirical stuff than there is theoretical stuff. So I'm thinking of expanding more the first part of the talk and perhaps writing a theory piece or kind of a piece on the ideology as opposed to the empirical literature. The first research that I find really fascinating is from social psychologist Barry Schwartz, who finds that choice is psychologically and physically taxing. So while we put so much emphasis on this choice thing, it is a lot of doggone work. And if it's a lot of work for people with a lot of resources, you can imagine how stressful it is for people with fewer resources. So these are tidbits from some of the research that I think and these tidbits are relevant to my own study. Both low and high income parents value academic quality, but higher SES parents show greater preferences for academics in their choices. So I'm trying to get away from the notion that some of the reasons we see inequality in the outcomes that after people make choices is that some people just have different kinds of values. In the end, people want the same kinds of things. They might think differently about the process to get there, or when faced with certain kinds of trade-offs, be making different decisions. Part of the reason they might be making different decisions are these two things here. So white parents seem to show a particular interest in the school racial composition, i.e. preferring majority white schools, and so racial composition seems to be particularly important for white parents in choosing schools. And working class parents seem to value interdependence, meaning making decisions that are good for a larger collective, are good for family and friends, whereas middle class parents seem to privilege independence in their choice practices, things that are good for me and my family. And these are all school choice practices. And in the voucher housing world, there's been a lot of research on these various experimental and non-experimental programs with lots of letters that I won't talk a lot about. But basically they find that black families with housing choice vouchers disproportionately move to black neighborhoods, and or even if they move out of black neighborhoods the first time, in secondary moves they move to progressively blacker neighborhoods. And so sometimes policymakers throw their hands in the air and they say, well, this isn't what we meant for this policy. How is it that folks are ending up in the neighborhoods we didn't mean them to end up in? And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And the hint there is one of my conclusions is going to be talking about inefficiency of these particular these particular policies. So what does this whole choice stuff assume? First, it assumes that people know they have a choice. Second, it assumes that people have equal resources to make choices. Third, it assumes that policymakers know what people are looking for in the first place. And fourth, it really assumes that policymakers know what promotes positive outcomes. Because even in this nudge idea, if you're nudging someone towards something, you assume that what you're nudging them toward creates the outcomes that you want. So I bracket this. I think that while we continue to do a lot of research in the schools and the neighborhoods realm, we do have some sense of what makes good schools and good neighborhoods. So we're not totally blind about this, and we could begin to promote those things at the very least. So in the schools literature, we know that high quality teachers and more time on task and small classroom sizes and a number of things like that promote good outcomes for kids. In the neighborhood things, of course, we know that low poverty rates in neighborhoods and high employment rates in neighborhoods and things like that promote good outcomes. So we have some sense, although we surely do not yet know the optimal neighborhood or school for every individual, because there's some interaction between families and neighborhood, of course. But I'm going to basically be studying the first three in the literature that I'll be showing. So let's start with schools. So this is an example from the Chicago Public Schools. I imagine that I was looking up some data before I came. Ohio actually has way more charters than does Illinois by leaps and bounds. I think Illinois only has like 35,000 kids in charter schools, and you all have 140,000 kids in charter school. So you all know this even better than I do, or firsthand, and looking at kind of options like this. So this is the CPS website, or at least it was when I made this slide. And the process was the following. First, you do your research. Second, you choose what school you want your child to go into. And third, you register. And so this, I would argue, is an idealized process, because you can do a lot of research And then number 3, instead of register, is pray and send money to somebody, talk to your grandmama, and do everything you can do to get your child in the child that you did your research on and that you chose, and now your child is in a lottery, or your child has to take the selective enrollment exam, or whatever the case may be. So the register part is the stressful part for many families. So what did we do? I worked with Lori DeLele O'Connor, who is a former graduate student from Northwestern, and we interviewed parents who had kids entering a traditional neighborhood public high school and a charter public high school very nearby. So it was in the same neighborhood, and so we would imagine some of the parents would have been looking at schools in that same neighborhood. You see the ends are pretty different. We had a lot more parents from charter high than from neighborhood high, and part of that was kind of, I think, borne out in the rest of the data. The parents at charter high were much more likely to have a working phone. The letters that we sent them were much less likely to come back to us. They were much more likely to be in the system for us to contact them. The neighborhood high, we had the records of everybody who was supposed to start that fall in 9th grade, but all of those people didn't come to the open house where we try to solicit interviews, and so it was much more difficult contacting neighborhood high parents. But we did 28 interviews with neighborhood high parents and 48 interviews with charter high parents. We also did a survey. Here you see the demographics. Both schools are pretty much all African American. The free and reduced lunch tally at charter high we didn't have at that time, but it's fewer low-income students than at neighborhood high. Charter high is much smaller than neighborhood high, and the test scores for neighborhood high were really, really low, ranks very low on student and test score outcomes, and charter high didn't have test scores at that time. And now charter high is going better than the neighborhood public schools, but not by any stretch off the charts in terms of test score outcomes. So first, this was the most eye-opening, perhaps, part of the study, which is, we thought this was a study about choice, but, oh, this isn't the right slide. So this is the demographics. I'm one ahead of myself. This is the demographics to show what was our hypothesis, actually. It affirms our hypothesis. Again, these are small samples. I'm not arguing statistical significance here, but so this is descriptive that the parents at charter high have slightly more education, have much higher incomes. These are income categories. Much higher income, much more likely to be employed, i.e. have a lower unemployment rate, and more likely to be married. So on the face of it, socioeconomically more advantaged. Okay, so this was there's something flying in front of the screen.
It's the blower to cool us all off.
So this was the eye-opening screen, which is, we thought our research was on choice, and for some of the parents we interviewed, our research wasn't on choice at all, and we would ask, so how'd you choose this school for your son or daughter? And they said, I chose this school, they put me in this school. So this category here, assigned on the very bottom, was parents who weren't making a choice, but instead were assigned. And Lori DeLele O'Connor actually is working on an article about this, going to the default option. She's finding some really interesting things that, so these are the really default option folks, the folks who say, they put me here. But as you see, a lot of the other folks chose the neighborhood high, and so she's interested in how people choose the defaults, because the neighborhood high is the default, and how people choose the default. So look out for her work coming out. So here are some of the qualitative responses to the question. So first from neighborhood high, and you can hear some of the stuff that you see on this table. Because they only just say one school. Just your students should attend neighborhood high. That's it. They don't give you any options. No, no, no. No option whatsoever. Another parent said, I guess through their school they'll give you like the little paper and you fill it out, but they never give you like a pamphlet to go with it or tell you anything further than, well, here's the paper. Fill this out to see if your son or daughter can attend this school. And that